Good morning and welcome to this session of the UK Trade and Business Commission. My name is Aidan Connolly, I'm one of the commissioners here. Today we're going to be looking at an evidence session on the impact of new import checks. I will be chairing the first part of the session, and the second part with trade associations, bodies and experts will be chaired by Peter Norris. The first panel are SME owners, and we will be hearing evidence from Maurice Greig from Greig and Greig Partnership, Tanya Marriott, owner of Solution, and Daniel Lambert, Managing Director of Lambert Wines. Now, since leaving the EU, various new documentary requirements came into force on the 1st of January 2022, and these will be followed by physical checks on food products from the middle of the year. However, that might be pushed back again, as we're hearing, as the rumours fly around. This session will look at the impact that the changes to date have made and come to have had on businesses, the haulage industry, ports across the UK. We'll also investigate the wider impact on UK trade, future plans such as the aspiration to have the most effective borders in the world by 2025. And of course, most importantly, we will have evidence from our small businesses and representative organisations. We will start with some introductions. I'm going to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves in a minute or less, and then we will start with questions from the commissioner, starting with me, and each of the commissioners, as usual, have around 7 minutes for their questions. So we shall start. Daniel, if you don't mind, I shall start with you. If you don't mind giving a 1 minute introduction as to who you are and who you represent.
Morning, everybody. So my name is Daniel Lambert. So I run Daniel Lambert Wines. We're a medium-sized company importing wine from around the world, currently shipping from 11 countries, predominantly EU, but also non-EU. So during the last year or so, or 2 years, should I say, we've been fully appraised with what's happening with Brexit being an excise good. It obviously has been applicable to the full force of Brexit, and there was no transition period, so to speak, in terms of paperwork and documentation. My company supplies UK-wide and also exports out to Caribbean markets, EU and British territory waters like Jersey, Isle of Man, etc. Yeah, that's pretty much who I am.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Moving on then to you, Tanya, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Tanya Marriott. I own Solution. We're a shoe retailer in the Bristol area. We've got 2 bricks and mortar stores and a website. We predominantly import, well, we don't import, we are imported to by our suppliers. There are on various terms, some of which all tend to be delivery paid, some are duty paid, some are not duty paid, but we're fully reliant on our suppliers for information. We do export a little bit through our website to the EU, America and Australia. That's us in a nutshell.
Thank you, Tanya. And last but by no means least, Maurice.
Yes, the Greig and Greig Partnership basically has 3 strings to its bow. One is a sales agency business, which primarily sells premium products throughout the UK and Ireland. We act as agents, so we represent Italian and Spanish companies here in the UK and Ireland. And my other business, which is Hardy and Parsons, which is my passion, is a niche bridal leather business, which I founded 20 years ago. And I export throughout the world, from Japan to China to the US. We are, though, a very small company.
Thank you very much. We'll move on then to the set questions, and I suppose the first one you have answered. What does your business, or what trade does your business conduct? But I'd like to dive a little bit further on the importation, and just very briefly on what areas you have mentioned a couple, but if you could go into a little bit more detail of the areas both within the EU and rest of the world from which you import. So I'll go in reverse order this time. So Maurice, please, if you don't mind.
Yes, I import exclusively from the EU. I import hats from Spain and socks, umbrellas, gloves, ties, outerwear from Italy.
Thank you. Tanya, please.
Majority of our suppliers are EU based, so but lots of them manufacture elsewhere in the world, whether it be Southeast Asia, China, South America, and therefore where the goods come through can be quite complex as to whether they come via the EU or come directly on ships into the UK. So identifying the ports of origin can sometimes be, or the area where the goods have come through is sometimes tricky. So yeah, it's worldwide really.
The next question is actually going to be on rules of origin and that sort of thing, but yeah, that's one that we're severely aware with. Thank you. Daniel, please.
So as I said, so we import, in terms of value, about £3 million worth of wine to the UK per annum. So that's quite a lot of wine. Around 80% is coming from the EU, so Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Austria, predominantly for sale in the UK market, whether that be with blue chips, high street names that you would know, or whether it be the independent sector, which then goes out for resale to around about 3,000 to 4,000 stores around the UK. So quite a spread across the country.
Thank you. So we will move on to that rules of origin question. And Tanya, since you brought it up, I shall start with you. To what extent are rules of origin an issue for your business in determining which products can be imported free of tariffs?
We are completely reliant on the information we receive from our suppliers on that. And therefore, for those that import on our behalf, so they deal with all the paperwork, it's not so much of an issue, but that does then become an issue if we're then selling the goods online back into the EU, because then we have to go back and ask the question to ensure that we're exporting correctly, or if there's putting the right information on the information so that the receiver doesn't have the wrong duty. Yeah, so that's sort of where it's a difficult one. It's out of our control completely, really.
Thank you very much. Maurice, sticking with as far as clothing and that sort of thing, there's definite problems there.
Yes, there are considerable problems, and not because of the origin, but because of the process. The freight forwarders just love to slap duty on everything, and then it's up to the receiver to fight the cause, and it really is doing my head in, quite frankly, because I'm getting non-stop phone calls from my customers here in the UK saying, we've just received socks, we've just received hats, etc., and duty has been slapped on them. And I asked for the statement of origin on the invoices, and it's all there, very clear, no issue at all, yet the DHLs, the FedExes, the UPSs all slap duty on it. And then it's up to the receiver to fight the cause. Of course, I fight for them on their behalf because it's in my interest to make sure good customer service, that they do get the duty that they've paid back. And in some instances, when I exported, for instance, to Germany and to Spain, because DHL wanted a €50 fee to examine the case and non-refundable, then I said, no, I will actually refund the duties to my customers. The customers were grateful for that, but it's a cost that I have incurred that I should never have incurred.
And can I ask on that, you mentioned it is the freight forwarders, and do you think that it is simply being risk averse and that's why they're doing it, or is it because of ease?
I think it's probably risk averse, and also it helps their cash flow.
Right. Daniel, sorry, go ahead.
Being a little bit sort of, tricky on that one, but why would they? Why would they? If they have the declaration, why do they have to charge that? It doesn't make any sense, quite frankly.
Thank you, Maurice. Daniel, I saw you nodding away intently during everything that Maurice was saying there.
It just amuses me how we have a cartel of transporters now in the UK quite hell-bent on charging charges they don't need to charge. So I think I'm going to take you through the protocol, because many people aren't actually aware of what the protocols are for rules of origin. It's quite interesting. Obviously, as I say, being excise goods, we've had to do this from day one. We had 6 days to prepare, bearing in mind that the transition agreement was all agreed on Christmas Eve 2020. We had until January the 1st to work this all out, which of course we're really grateful about that. Anyway, the rules of origin is quite interesting. The first thing that surprised everybody in Europe was that they needed a REX number. I don't know whether people are aware of that, but without a REX number, you can't actually export out of the EU to a third country. The majority of our suppliers, despite us saying get prepared for Brexit, it's going to affect you just as much as it affects us because of the supply chain mechanism. 90% of them didn't have a REX number. The second bit of joy with rules of origin was that even though we have an FTA with Europe, the government didn't actually affect the coding on the systems in the UK until the 15th of January. So nothing entered the UK for the first 15 days after they did their trade agreement. That's a fact. I had the head of HMRC apologising to me on the phone on the 14th of January 2020, saying, yeah, we dropped the ball on this one. Direct quote. Anyway, the fact of the matter is, without the REX number, you can't actually get out of Europe. Now, as I say, the cartel that has been created with DHL, UPS, and every other transporter you can possibly imagine, whether it be parcels, boxes, pallets, it doesn't really matter. All of them are charging a fee for duty declarations. Let's be really clear here. To access the MRN system, which is what you need to do to actually clear something from Europe, is free to access for anybody in Europe. To enter or access the UK version, Chief or CDS, is also technically free to access. So why are they charging a fee when it's free to actually access and do the declarations themselves? The reason they're charging a fee is because there are so few qualified people to actually be able to make a declaration. So you can start to say to yourself, well, okay, you've got a new business here that started up that is effectively taking advantage of the fact that the UK has left the EU and that we now have the privilege of having to fill in endless reams of paperwork for no financial gain to anybody, apart from the people who are actually doing the paperwork. Yeah. Now, as I say, I'm a bonded warehouse owner. The reason I know all this is because we have a bonded warehouse and we actually do the paperwork ourselves, much to the annoyance of the transporters, because they can't charge us because we do it ourselves. They actually want to now charge, some of the transporters actually have threatened to not pick our goods up anymore unless they can do the declaration for us. And it's only when I point out, actually, you can't do the paperwork declaration because we are a bonded warehouse, we need to actually do it. That's when they back down. So it's become an industry within an industry to charge people for declarations that don't need to be charged for. To give an example, in the wine industry, you get charged £75 for an MRN to leave the EU. And if you can't do the paperwork on the UK side, you get charged another £75 for it to enter the UK. So there's £150 just in nonsense. To put it into perspective, pre-Brexit, to ship a pallet from Europe would have cost you around about £180, there or thereabouts, for one single pallet. You're now looking at about 420 to 450. That's the true effect of Brexit. That's why stuff's going up. It's not because it needs to, it's because these declarations are having a major impact on the cost of goods. And that's why the bigger companies don't really care, because they're shipping in volume. This is all about volume. If you ship one pallet, it's not sustainable. If you ship a container, it doesn't really make much difference. So this is where the big blue chips are not that bothered, and you haven't really seen much of a price difference with the big guys, but with the smaller SMEs, they're reeling. They can't afford to maintain this. They're not sustainable. They're having to pass the cost on. The consumer, of course, isn't being made aware of that because the government is telling us everything wonderful about Brexit and we have all this freedom. The reality is that we're all drowning in paperwork, paying extra costs for the privilege, and the consumer is being left blissfully unaware.
Can I ask one quick supplementary on that? How if you were to put it in general terms, how much of an increase to the consumer would you say that there has been because of this?
It depends on the product, because obviously you have a sliding scale on wines from cheapest to most expensive. So it's not as simple as that. I would say on average, you've seen about a 20 to 40p at cost on wine, at cost. By the time you apply margins and all the other existing costs that go onto that, it works out at about £1 to £1.10 on a bottle.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty stark. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Jeff Mackey, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. We've already started to hear about some of the challenges that have appeared. I'd like to talk a little bit about processes and actually start to examine some of that. Regarding processes for importation, could you just describe how that has changed for your business and what you're doing since December 2020? And I'm also interested in having some idea of timescales on both sides of the divide, if I may. Could we start? Sorry, I was going to say, could we start with Daniel, please?
Okay, fine. Okay, so it's a great question, and it's quite a long answer, I'm afraid. So I'll be as quick as I can. Pre-Brexit, it was a very simple, and I think this is the fundamental thing that people need to understand between pre and post-Brexit. In the pre-Brexit world, we lived in a world where everything was a movement with the EU as opposed to an import. Now, in the post-Brexit world, everything is an import. That is a fundamental shift. It's a fundamental change, and it's why we have all the paperwork, basically. In the pre-Brexit world, we used the system, the whole of Europe, including the UK, used a system called EMCS, and you could move any one product, didn't matter what it was, from one point in the EU 28 to another point in the EU 28 with this one document, and that would be passage to wherever it was going. Very, very simple. All the member states are a part of it. You would literally, one side would fill the form in. At the other end, my company, for example, would tick a box and say, yes, it's arrived intact, no problem. So the process took no more than 2 or 3 minutes when you receive stock. Very, very simple, very, very easy. Even with excise goods, it was very, very straightforward. The new process has, last time I counted, 11 processes now. From 1 to 11, we've basically gone. So to go through the process now, we have to raise obviously an order. The order then has to be sent back to us by pro forma. On the pro forma, we need to have the Rex number, the ORI number, the excise number, the ORI number, the commodity codes for all of the products. We need to know the volumes of the volume of size of the packaging and products, and the actual number of boxes, etc. Once we have that, we can then pursue to the next level, which is to engage the transporter. The transporter will then contact the particular vineyard, wherever they happen to be, arrange the collection. The then producer will raise the EMCS document as they did previously in the post-Brexit world, which will get it to the exit point within the EU. The producer will need to know the exit point before they fill their paperwork in. Each exit point in the EU has a different number. For example, most stuff will come through Calais. Most stuff, I'm not saying all, but in the wine world, most stuff comes through Calais and enters through Dover. So the code for Calais would be FR00730, for example. But each port or exit point has a different code number. That you need to know before you get to it. Once that's done, whichever country it's leaving from, and all of the rules of the 27 remaining nations have different rules of exit, depending on where it's coming from. So with France, for example, it can be determined once it gets to port. So then they have to create what's called an MRN. The MRN is the document that allows the system, EMCS, to clear down the document so that the EU system knows that the product is no longer within the EU. That's the point of the MRN. Once it arrives in Dover, the UK paperwork takes over, whether it be bonded or unbonded, because you have the choice. In my case, it will be bonded because it's excise goods and it comes to our bonded warehouse. So we then need to create a new UK movement on UK EMCS. We need to create a chief entry, which gives us a SAD number. The SAD number is the reference that allows you to link into the new system the government created, which is GMCV, which is the lorry driver code, which is using AMPR to recognise what comes into the UK. and you also need to be registered for all those systems. Once you've done all of that, we can create our documentation, and eventually after about 4 weeks, we'll get our stock. So lead time pre-Brexit, 7 days. Current lead time from EU, about a month. Cost increased by 2 to 200 quid a pallet, there or thereabouts. Paperwork time increased by probably 2 hours per document.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Tanya, for your business, do you recognize the same sorts of confusion, complicated processes and costs that we've just heard about?
Yes. It's the simple answer. As I said previously, most of our suppliers import on our behalf, but whereas previously we were able to get special orders for customers within 2 days, 3 days maximum, we can't order special orders for customers because the suppliers are refusing point blank to ship just one pair of shoes. And deliveries are taking between 2 to 3 weeks at an absolute, on a good run. Most of them are having to wait to have a full container before they can ship it because of all the paperwork and the complexities. You can't share containers, lorry loads coming in from different brands or different suppliers. The costs on paperwork, the fact that they're having to set up, majority of our suppliers had warehouses in the EU that they'd pull the stock down from for the UK. They're now having to incur extra costs, which for either setting up warehouses in the UK or setting up bonded warehouses in Europe so that they don't have to incur double duty, because obviously if goods are coming out from outside the EU, they're coming into the EU and being charged duty and then being charged duty again to come into the UK. And duty on coming into the UK is also charged. The duty is calculated including freight costs, which on a container I've been told had gone from £2,000 to ship from China to now you're talking more than 20,000 to ship a container from China, and duty by the UK government is being charged including freight, which the inflationary costs on that for shoes is just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, at the moment, majority of our suppliers are taking that cost and realizing that they don't want to, sort of increasing the cost of shoes by £20 is not going to be great from a sales perspective, but there's only so long that they can maintain that. And, and say, because we sell branded product, we sell at recommended retail price. So we don't have the option to increase our margins either. And as a small business, we need those margins to be able to survive.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Maurice.
Well, I'm fortunate in the sense that all my suppliers are EU based and manufacture everything in the EU as such. So it's a simpler and smoother import procedure where, the goods are genuinely made in the EU and certified as such. In terms of costs and timing, funnily enough, I am experiencing more problems exporting with timing than I am in importing. Importing is actually quite quick. I mean, I receive, basically, from my point of view, I just receive sample collections twice a year, which I show to my customers, and they come in within 3 days. I've received them from the day they have been shipped. So I think I'm lucky in that sense, because it's a simpler operation, and the invoice value of the samples is nominal because they are samples, and therefore they don't have the actual value that would be applicable if you were to sell them on. So I am quite lucky in that, and long may it last for me. But hearing Dan's and Tanya's situation, I'm very concerned that negative for me in due course.
Thanks very much, Maurice. Can we just have a quick conversation around that? I mean, we're talking about how it affects different people in different ways. is there government assistance available? Are you aware of any way of support, or have you accessed any support, Maurice?
Yes, I have attended 2 courses. I'll tell you what they were called. They were 2-day courses. One was UK VAT and international trade. That was one. And then the other one was import and export practice and procedures. They were 2-day, full-day courses, and they were quite good. When I ended up having the problem that I mentioned before, where the customers were actually in Germany and in Spain were complaining about having to pay duties, I raised it with the lecturer, and the lecturer said, well, they shouldn't have been charged. So it was, it was a dead end. There was nothing I could do about it.
Tanya, what's been your experience about assistance?
I've tried to look at the HMR website. Because I'm not physically importing the goods, I don't believe that there's an awful lot of help out there, but just trying to understand what's happening, because I need to understand why the impact is happening. I'm sort of relying on suppliers at the moment to try and explain where they're coming from. But the reply, having spoken to lots of our suppliers, their response is that they're bamboozled by quite a lot of it. So nothing's very clear. Everything's being made, decisions are being made last minute. It's very much a reactionary situation, as opposed to being able to plan and put something in place to be able to sort of, the rules are changing too often, or being said that they're going to change and then not changing, and and then being delayed, which then has impacts on what you're trying to do. So
thanks very much. Daniel, would you like to change the tone of the conversation or follow the theme regarding government assistance?
Okay, well, I mean, in fairness to HMRC, I obviously, being bonded warehouse keeper, I obviously have regular contact with HMRC, and that's part of the course of what I do. If the truth be told, I think HMRC are doing the very best they can. They're under immense pressure to deliver what they've got to be delivered with. The problem isn't coming from HMRC. The problem is clearly coming from this rather exceptional government, who are, how can I say, beyond belief in how they don't actually have a clue what they're doing. Some of the comments I've had with very senior people in HMRC are incredibly critical about government and how they're being led down the garden path. In terms of support, it's actually, we're probably giving more support to HMRC than HMRC is giving to us. As I said, I opened up with the fact that we actually pointed out to HMRC that the coding for tariff-free hadn't actually been applied to the systems, and they apologised to us and thanked us for pointing out that they hadn't actually applied it. So it's quite ironic, really. Have we received any support? No. We've actually made sure that we've been fully up to speed with everything. We started to apply for and be ready for Brexit back in August 2020. We had to, again, because of the fact we are excise goods, we had the full impact of Brexit pretty much from day one, where other industries are now only feeling it in the last few months. But yes, we were offered training through PricewaterhouseCoopers. We were supposed to get budget support. None of that's ever materialised. In terms of actual training, we've been offered training, which we have actually taken on the new system that comes into place in September on CDS, which is another little bit of joy later on in the year, but hopefully we'll touch on what's coming down the line later on. But yes, as a business, we have been self-sufficient, and we have adapted and managed in-house with no support from government, certainly, and with HMRC doing its very, very best to support us. But at the same time, they're also playing catch up. And I think this is the biggest thing about Brexit, that the country wasn't prepared for it. The country still isn't actually prepared for it. It's business that is muddling along, should I say, and doing the very best it can, whilst media and government pretend that there is no problem. And I think that's probably what infuriates me the most, that it's business that's making Brexit happen, yet it's business owners like me that are making it, trying to make it work, that get criticised for criticising Brexit.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you very much, Chair, back to you if I may.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Moving on now to Paul Blomfield, MP, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I really want to follow up with a couple of the themes that you've already touched on and Jeff has in his questions, or at least that have come out of the answers, which is kind of the big question in terms of the impact all this is going to have, both on your profitability and on customers. So what impact have the changes already had? What impact do you think they're going to have on prices and choice? And I'm conscious, for example, that Daniel, you talked about a £1.10 per bottle, but actually kind of looking at that a little bit more broadly. Tanya, you said that costs have been absorbed up until now, but that was unsustainable. So some sense of where we're going with price and choice, but also where consequently you think how your business model is going to be affected and what your future planning is as a consequence of that. So perhaps I could start with Daniel.
Okay, again, it's a great question. I mean, the obvious answer, the very quick answer, is that choice is going to be reduced dramatically in the UK market, as it is unsustainable for our industry to do what used to be called the group R shipment. It was a major part of the UK wine industry, particularly in the niche end of the market where I predominantly do a lot of my business, whereby people would seek out small producers in parts of Europe who were producing premium quality wines and sell them through independent wine shops. That type of business is being fundamentally damaged by Brexit. There's no question, there's no argument. We don't need to debate it for hours on end. That business is fundamentally being strangled to a death. And eventually, over a period of time, many, many little wine shops will cease to trade because they will not be able to buy the niche products that they previously were purchasing in the pre-Brexit world, because it's simply not affordable to do it anymore. How we have adapted is that we have taken on the fact of a bonded warehouse whereby we have started to ship in bulk, and we hold probably 3 or 4 times as much stock now to try and maintain the status quo that we had previously. And the only reason I can do that is because we've been trading 30 years. We have fantastic relationships with all of our producers around the world, and they're prepared to allow us to extend credit terms so that we can basically have the dead stock sitting in our warehouse under bond until we're ready to put it to market. That's the only way we've been able to do it. There are thousands of businesses who are not as prepared as we were, and certainly wouldn't have a bonding facility. I think we're one of only 3 in Wales that has it. So it puts it into perspective of how we're doing it. But even though we have all of these things to use to our advantage, the constraints that we're seeing are making it harder and harder to maintain volume, to maintain breadth of range, but without increasing price. It's inevitable that you're going to have an inflationary market within the wine industry, and you're going to have less choice. And that's certainly not what anybody wants in our industry. It's certainly not what the consumer wants. It's not what we want to be offering. But as I say, we are being led down this garden path, and there's very little we could do about it. To try and fight against this, I've actually now set up an entity in Europe myself. My Daniel Lambert Wines France business has just been set up so that I can actually do interbond transports between the EU and my UK business in-house within the same business to try and mitigate as much of this paperwork and expense as possible. But I can only do that because I'm a dual national. You know? So Brexit is a complete disaster, and the sooner the UK public wake up to the fact it is a disaster and it is seriously holding the UK economy back, the sooner we can all move on from this experiment that's going very badly wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting your observation about setting up activity in the rest of Europe, which is kind of we've heard from many other businesses over the last year or so. Does that mean that this is new activity, or are you kind of shifting activity,
No. This is to try and maintain the status quo. What we're trying to do, we've realised as a business, we'll have a competitive advantage if we can maintain prices, which is what we're trying to do.
Right.
And so by maintaining, not increasing, but just by maintaining price, when everything else is going up, all of a sudden we'll become super competitive. So the only way we can do that is by having a business in the EU, in this case it will be France, whereby we group everything together in France under the wonderful system they have there and move full containers to the UK so that we get the volume that we need.
But that adds to your costs.
Not necessarily, because there's a logistic cost anyway to move it. So long as the key with logistics is the more times you move it, the more it's going to cost you. You want to keep the movements to a minimum. But if you move in volume, then the logistic cost comes down. And as I say, the declaration, if there's one declaration and one MRN rather than on a container where you have 24 pallets, all from individual vineyards, if you have 24 declarations, it's not viable. If I can get all of that into white business in France and then move it to the UK as one declaration, then all of a sudden it's viable again. And this is what a lot of the larger corporate companies are now doing. This is very much the game at the moment. And this is where SMEs will be left behind because they can't afford it. They don't have the cash flow. And more importantly, in my particular situation, I can do it because I have nationality in France. You can only set up a business in France if you don't actually live in France, if you have nationality. That's the only reason I'm able to do it.
Okay, many thanks. And graphic warnings there about smaller businesses.
Yeah.
Tanya, what's it look like for you? You're saying that at the moment, you and your suppliers are absorbing costs. What does the future look like?
We haven't been absorbing costs. Our suppliers have been absorbing costs. I've just completed our buying for the autumn winter season because we've purchased 6 months in advance of stock coming in for manufacturing purposes and things like that. Shoes at cost price on average are going up between £5 and £10 as of next autumn winter, which is an increase between £10 and £20 at retail, which is going to be hitting school shoes. It's going to be hitting ladies. It's a huge inflationary pressure, and part of that is because duty is being charged on freight in the UK. That doesn't happen in the US. It doesn't happen in Canada. So there's been I think one of my suppliers was saying a 500% increase in duty, which is an inflationary pressure yes, I get it's going into the government coffers, but it's not helping the inflationary pressures in the UK because presumably that's not just happening on shoes. It's also happening. The other issue is the fact that we get double duty. So you bring it into Europe, you're getting hit. They're being hit by duty there. They're then being hit by duty again when they bring them into the UK. And there isn't a shoe manufacture trade left in the UK. So it's not like they can open up there isn't the skills there. There isn't, there's more. The DB, one of our suppliers, has actually just closed their manufacturing unit in Northamptonshire because they can't get the parts for the equipment that they have to service it. So therefore it's been cheaper for them to export the manufacturing to Portugal as opposed to having it done in the UK, which I appreciate doesn't impact duty, but it's increasing costs. It means suppliers can't give us they can't ship us special orders. So as a small business, one of our benefits is the customer service we offer, the selection that we offer, the choice that we offer, the fact that we could previously order stuff in especially for customers. We can't offer that anymore because the costs, as Daniel was saying, to ship one pair of shoes and do all the paperwork relating to it is a huge increase in costs, and suppliers just aren't willing to do that.
So what do you think the future looks like for your business, Tanya?
Less choice, higher prices, and making it much more difficult for us to offer what we're good at. And I can't imagine, the shoe trade generally, as independent shoe shops, we're shrinking. There's less and less of us on the high street because of and it's particularly for kids' feet, it's really important because the impact it has on their health, the impacts on the NHS is, there's knock-on effects everywhere. So yeah, I'm hopeful I mean, my business is in a good place. I'm not but it's just the very difficult unknowns at the moment, particularly with other costs going up, because people do see shoes as a luxury item quite often, as opposed to which, on the basis we need them to walk around in, is it just makes it very difficult.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I'm conscious of time, but Maurice, are there any observations you'd like to make from the perspective of your business briefly?
Yeah, sure. The impact of the new rules, which came into force in January, have already impacted on the supply chain for leather, as an example. My UK tannery has announced a price increase of 10% this week, starting from tomorrow. So that is a major blow immediately. I can understand why they're doing it, because of shortage of skins and serious delivery delays and problems like that. But the dilemma for me will be, do I pass this increase on as well as the other increases, such as energy, fuel, etc., or do I try to absorb part of it? Well, my concern for the future of both my agency and leather business is, at what point will my customers opt for cheaper products if prices continue to rise, as they have done recently? My business model has always been to sell top quality products which are genuinely made in the UK, Italy, or Spain. And I will continue to be true to this tenet.
Many thanks indeed. Can I, and I appreciate that, Maurice, can I pass back to you, Chair?
Thank you very much, Paul. Moving on now for a question and a supplementary from Liz Saville-Roberts, MP, please.
Thank you, Edward. I've just got a very quick question to Maurice to pick up on a point that you raised earlier, and then I want to move from looking at the present state of affairs to looking into the future. But you mentioned the freight forwarders, and others have mentioned that carriers are slapping charges on. Is there anything the government could do to remedy this? And if so, what?
Well, yes. I mean, surely the government should be investigating why are these charges being slapped on, because the freight forwarders are acting on behalf of HMRC to collect the tax, which they then pay to HMRC. Well, HMRC should actually be investigating why are these complaints being raised and nothing being done about it.
Thank you very much. It seemed something that perhaps we should know as commissioners. As I said, I'd like to now, we know that full sanitary and phytosanitary checks have yet to be implemented, and then there's a series of dates starting in July this year and then September and November. If I could go through each of the three of you, how you anticipate that these changes, when the SPS checks are brought in, what these changes will mean to you. Daniel, if I could start with you, and then Tanya.
Okay, I mean, obviously the checks for sanitary and food are not so relevant for wine because it's wine. And as I say, we've had all the full checks from day one anyway. The checks that are changing for us is organics and the introduction of CDS happening in September. That's when the next big thing in the wine industry will take place. So to quickly go through that, we have the nonsense now that all organic wine coming into the UK has to be certified through an organic importer. We've gone through the process and are now certified as an organic importer as well as a regular importer. But to give you an idea of the lunacy of the regulations, which admittedly these are actually inherited from EU and could have been changed but weren't, we have to have a separate part of our warehouse to ensure that, and I quote, that our wine that is organic doesn't get contaminated by the non-organic wine. Very, very important, apparently.
Does strike me that that's physically quite difficult to happen.
Well, you know, they are in boxes and corks and capsules, you know, but apparently it's very important. And when I said to them, you are joking, they said, no, we will actually audit you. And if we find that you've got your organic wines mixed with your non-organic, we'll revoke your license. I mean, it's beyond belief. But anyway,
useful illustration. Thank you, thank you, Dan. If I can, Tanya, if I could move on, evidently with leather products.
I don't know is the honest answer. Again, because I'm not physically importing the goods, I'm not as up to speed with exactly. I understand that because the product is finished, it's not doesn't need to go through the checks as such. But again, I can't comment really.
Okay. I mean that because you are a professional in the field, I think the fact that the information available to you is actually, or it's not, is in itself quite telling, actually, that people don't know, because this will be in, leather is in, am I correct in, this will be in November, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think one of the, because I don't have to directly do it, because it's, as a small business, you're wearing so many hats all of the time and trying to juggle so many different things that it's almost a case of, if I don't need to know it, I haven't got the capacity or the staff to be able to, particularly as a retailer. I'm head office and back office, my staff are on the shop floor, and there's only so much capacity available to
Yeah, that's really telling. It's a real, and that's a phenomenon for SMEs. I think we've already picked that up on the charges as well, the pallets versus containers and the entire. Thank you very much. Maurice, to you, because you're different sorts of
well, as far as the leather aspect of it, again, I don't really know, because frankly, I have no idea whether any of the products I sell require SPS checks. This is something which I will have to ask my suppliers in the first instance, and to see if they are aware of what this is. But I believe that, just like Tanya, that we're okay until November for the leather products. But then what happens then is, well, we'll have to find out.
Okay. I mean, given that there are a few months, what would you, if you could ask now of the UK government, what would you as a business like them to provide for you to prepare you for November?
Well, face-to-face seminars where a speaker would actually tell us exactly what needs to be done. Very much like the courses that I attended earlier on in the year, where it's very useful to actually meet somebody, discuss problems, and clarify what needs to be done.
Anything else with that sense of what's coming down the line? Does anybody else like to contribute what looking ahead should be for you?
Well, I mean, I've got an unrelated thing, but it doesn't really relate to this, so I'm hoping that will come up later on.
Okay. I mean, for me, I am very fast tracked onto a train to get to Wales to do the Welsh version of Christmas time. So if you'll forgive me, I'll hand it to the chair.
Thank you very much, Liz. Daniel, please do make your point, even if it is unrelated, before we go to the last question in this session.
Okay, so the point I was going to make is actually something, it is unrelated, but it's the Chancellor's decision to make life even more difficult for wine importers. As you may know, the alcohol reform bill that's going through will be going through Parliament in about May. We currently have already a very difficult system in terms of importation paperwork, etc. Obviously, I keep on referring to the fact that we have an excise good here. Obviously, the government is getting £2.23 on every single bottle of wine that enters the UK. That is the current tax take on a bottle of wine at 13%. The Chancellor, in his wisdom, seems to think that having 3 tiers of alcohol duty on wine is far too simple, and he would rather have 27 levels of taxation on wine. So as from February next year, he not only wants to put the duty, he wants to increase the duty, but he also wants to put the burden on business to tell us with our crystal balls what the alcohol percentage is on our wine before we've actually seen it on every 0.5% of alcohol. So basically he wants to change it from 8.5 all the way up to 22% and change the rate at every 0.5%. So I don't quite see how that's workable.
And that'll obviously change year by year as wines change, and that's...
Well, yeah, he hasn't, being a teetotaler, he hasn't worked out that wine is climatic. The sun makes the alcohol in the wine, not like beer or spirits where it's set at an ABV. It's dependent on what happens with the climatics. And so therefore it is impossible to know what the ABV is until it turns up. But under the premise he's got is we should have a crystal ball and know this before it actually arrives. Moreover, I already know how complicated it is to do a declaration based on 3 levels of taxation, and it takes hours to have 27 levels of taxation. I have to ask the question legitimately, are they actually trying to destroy the UK industry for wine importation? Is that what they're trying to do? Because this latest little proposal that Sunak thinks is so fantastic, that he denies, by the way, and it is evidenced by the WSTA, which is the organisation that represents the wine industry, it's so ludicrous, and every single national paper has picked up on how ludicrous it is, but he's now denying that that's the actual plan. But he hasn't actually come up with an alternative. So I would very much like all the MPs to ask him in Parliament, why is it that 3 is going to be more simple? Sorry, how can 27 levels of taxation be more simple than 3? I really would encourage all of our MPs to ask him that question next time they have the chance.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask a question which is slightly at odds with the evidence that we've heard this morning, but I must ask it. What opportunities do you think there may be from wider trade deals or the reduction in UK government regulation? And I'm going to start with Tanya this time, please.
I'm not sure. It's very difficult to see through what the current situation is on the basis a reduction in UK regulation. It doesn't appear to be happening at all anyway. And having just listened to Daniel, it seems to be getting worse. So I struggle to see how it's going to be reduced. Wider trade deals, the majority of my suppliers are EU. So it's very difficult to, we sell branded product. There aren't that many brands that aren't situated in the EU that we deal with. So it's all that seem to come over to the UK to tout for business, for want of a better word. So yeah, I'm struggling with that one a little bit.
Okay, same question to Mars, please. Do you see any opportunities with the wider trade deals?
Well, any trade deal would be most welcome. However, focus should be on simplifying matters between the EU and the UK. Given that, and this is from a report from the Commons Library, so, official, that the UK taken as a whole, the EU taken as a whole is the UK's largest trading partner. In 2020, UK exports to the EU were 251 billion. 42% of all UK exports, 42% of all UK exports. And UK imports from the EU were 301 billion, 50% of all UK imports. It is insane that we're hitting ourselves on the foot by doing this. Simplify UK-EU rules. That's the key question, more than spending a lot of time trying to get new trade deals, which of course are very welcome, don't get me wrong.
Thanks, Mars. Daniel, surely there are opportunities with other wine producing countries other than in the EU.
Yeah, there's plenty of opportunities. I'll take you through the opportunity with the Australian deal. You'll like this. So obviously we've done the FTA with Australia and obviously now New Zealand, which is fantastic, and it's very welcome because obviously in the wine trade, I'm sure you're aware that there's plenty of Australian and New Zealand wine coming to Australia from Australia and New Zealand in the UK. So that's great. Now, I should point out at that stage that 66% of all wine in the UK is actually coming from the EU. So the EU obviously wins hands down. Australia is around about 10% and New Zealand is around about 9% of all the wine in the UK. So it's very, very small. Now, when they did the deal with Australia, it was interesting that the Australian government was very excited about the fact that the tariff was going to be dropped, which is 9p on a bottle, and that the VI1s, which I was personally responsible for getting rid of, dropped another 10p. So the tax take on the border crossing with the FTA dropped 20p off a bottle of Australian wine. That's great, right? You would think that's fantastic. Apart from what I touched on earlier, Sunak's little plan with his 27 levels of tax, bearing in mind Australia is 14.5% alcohol, guess how much tax that puts back on the bottle? 50p. So we're negative 30. Never mind.
Right. Do you see any opportunities, any other opportunities as far as...
Not why you've got this bunch of Muppets in government, no.
don't hold back. Say what you really feel. No, I can understand. I can understand your frustration. That is the end of this part of the session. I would like to very much thank Tanya, Morris, and Daniel for your evidence. It has been shocking in parts, but truly enlightening. Thank you very much for your time today. I'll now hand over to Peter Norris to chair the second panel in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. And thank you very much, all of our witnesses we've heard from so far. The second session, we're going to hear from some trade associations and service providers. And I'd like to start by asking our witnesses to briefly introduce themselves before we move into the questions. Leslie, can I start with you?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I've called in on my phone and I've never used it on Zoom before.
I can hear you fine. Is everybody
Lovely,
else?
brilliant,
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, great. So yeah, my name's Leslie Batchelor. I've worked in international trade for 40 odd years, and I've seen most things come and go, and worked in large companies, Ciba-Geigy, Coca-Cola, Fujitsu, and then set up on my own advising, working with government and various other governments to try and help small businesses in particular to engage with international trade. I had 12 years running the Institute of Export and International Trade, and I've set up export boot camps, Open Borders Direct, and a few other things in the meantime. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Leslie. Shane, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So my name is Shane Brennan, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Cold Chain Federation, which is a trade association representing the businesses that store and move frozen and chilled foods around the UK and in and out of the UK.
Thank you, Shane. And Peter.
Just unmuting myself. That's the classic error. I'm Peter Hardwick. I'm the Trade Policy Advisor at the British Meat Processors Association. My background is the meat industry. I've worked in it internationally in the UK, Spain, Brazil, Southern Africa, as well as spending 15 years on trade policy, working in Brussels for what was the Meat and Livestock Commission. So I've a long background in trade policy and in trade itself, particularly in the meat industry. The BMPA is the representative organisation for the large-scale meat processors in the UK.
Thank you, Peter. Our last witness, Tim Reardon, is unfortunately slightly delayed, so we'll introduce him when he's able to join us. But I'll start with the first question anyway, which I will put, and I'll divide it into two halves, if I may. The first is to ask you to comment on some of the logistical issues that have been encountered since the changes were made at the beginning of last year, and to comment on what sort of delays or other impediments are we seeing at the border. And where are we seeing these? In which are there key locations? Is Dover a standout, or is it being experienced across the UK? Shane, could I start with you?
Yes, by all means. So that's not a question you can answer in a linear way. You know, border delays are fluctuating. They happen sometimes. They don't happen at other times. Right now, literally today, we're seeing a delay of around 2 to 5 hours of getting goods out onto ferries and onto trains out of Dover and Calais, out of Dover, because of predominantly the capacity issues with the P&O ferry strike. We did see some delays because of implementing the changes on the 1st of January in the first few days, but again, those things sort of leveled out. And to be honest, the single biggest cause of delays on our Dover-Calais crossings is the weather, not customs controls. However, So I think we have to be careful about sort of seeing this issue in terms of the issue of queues and delays at the border. And in fact, if anything, we probably got ourselves into a bit of a false conversation running into the Brexit deadlines that we've seen at different points by talking about and seeing the whole issue through the prism of queues and disruption and hold-ups at the border. Because actually what's happened is, firstly, those that want to argue that Brexit hasn't had any impact, we'll just point to that there wasn't the catastrophic, 10,000 lorries parked up issues that were predicted in some of the planning, and they see that therefore as the barometer of success. The reality is the problem of Brexit, particularly on export flows up to now, and now starting this year with the import controls, is the trade that hasn't saddled up to come. And the phantom trade, the trade that never left the depot. I think that's where it's not a delay; it's just it's not even try that we're probably is the biggest concern, and that's our biggest concern going into 1st July, which is, I know, something we'll come to.
Do you want to give us a bit more colour on what your concern is about the changes in July?
So obviously, the 1st of July is the start of imposing the full SPS controls, sanitary and phytosanitary controls, on our meat and dairy goods in particular. Those are the nightmare of moving across a trade border for food goods, because they require veterinary certification at departure per consignment. They require potentially inspection at arrival at port of entry. And those are all sort of the fundamental barriers. That's something we'll recognise from the Northern Ireland point of view as well. And those haven't been imposed yet on our import flows. So when we look at some of the figures for how our food import flows over the last 18 months, that has all been done without the kind of full service, the full fat controls that we're going to start seeing from the 1st of July. The thing that we've seen is with our export flows, so our goods going out of the UK, our UK exporters trying to sell goods to the EU, we've seen a dramatic decline in the amount of goods that are actually even trying to leave the country. And this is a kind of a chorus on what you've heard in the last session. It's all about small businesses, and it's all about small volume exporters. The groupage loads where 5 or 6 customers going on one of my members' lorries to leave the country to go through the border, that trade has become basically impossible on the export routes, and will become impossible on the import routes starting on the 1st of July. And so we just expect that will be a collapse in our export flows for that specific type of trade. Not all trade, that specific type of trade, but that just particularly draws out a certain type of customer, particularly smaller businesses, but also a certain type of products that you can't buy in lorry loads. You can only buy in 2 or 3 pallets loads on a frequent basis. And that is where that trade, that is something that just can't happen over a 3rd country border. That's the reality of international trade flows all around the world. We have to unpack the integrated nature of our supply chains for food in order to sustain ourselves for the medium term post-Brexit.
We heard evidence earlier about an initiative to create a homegrown groupage business in France in the wine trade. Would the equivalent be possible in the UK to address the needs of the suppliers you're talking about?
So in order to take because there is going to be demand for goods. There are going to be demand for fresh mozzarella or certain types of charcuterie or whatever it is, stuff that needs to be bought in fresh. That will remain a demand for that. The supply chain for it has to reorganize and redesign. And effectively what you need to do is create wholesale middlemen. You need people who are going to buy in bulk, assemble on one side of the border, and then sell it then bring it into the other side of the border and then resell it from there. That creates a new cost center, a new profit center in the supply chain. It also creates a slowdown in inflexibility. And I guess the reality is that hasn't happened yet. And now one thing, it could be a criticism of industry. You could say, well, why hasn't industry already started doing this? Well, it's because the market doesn't exist yet, because there's been constant delays and kickbacks in terms of bringing in these controls. But also it's a commercially illogical thing to do unless you absolutely have to. And that's where things will start to come from this year onwards. For those, again, this is for this type of good. This is very much focusing in on those small volume, fast frequency goods that we're particularly talking about.
Yeah.
Peter, would you like to add your comments from the point of view of the meat industry?
Yes, I would. First of all, I found the previous session absolutely fascinating, and if Daniel could have seen my head nodding like a nodding dog, he would have found it quite amusing, because actually the analogy with the large scale businesses is much closer than you might imagine. I think the first thing to say is our anticipation is that in time the complexities that we face on exports will be faced on imports. And to answer the direct question about delays at borders, one of the reasons they're not seen at borders is that the delays take place further back down the supply chain. So if a vehicle is going to deliver goods to the port of Dover or any other port for that matter, he has to go through a number of processes. Daniel described 11. Because we are covered by SPS, we actually have 13. Most of them are exactly the same. And in fact, I have a fascinating couple of slides, which I will perhaps share with you later, showing the difference, the before and after. The before is we used to deliver to customers in Birmingham or Berlin in exactly the same way with a single document. Now we export, and I often present to people and explain the fact that many of our businesses haven't exported for 40 years at all. That doesn't mean they didn't sell to customers in Europe. They just didn't export because it wasn't exports. It was trade within a single market. When you step across the border from Norway into Sweden, you're stepping into Spain from a practical point of view in terms of the movement of goods and so on. So that complexity and those delays are occurring, and we'll perhaps come on to it later. But prior to this meeting, I decided to survey my members just to get some sense, and this is for fresh food. And fresh food it's critical. The reason that we do so much of our trade with the European Union is that we're able to compete like for like with European businesses in delivering fresh food across the European Union. At least we used to be able to do so. And moreover, business has changed. Businesses don't want a full truckload of sides of beef. They want it neatly presented either for retail or for distribution on a regular basis. So even the large businesses are delivering pallet loads to individual distributors in the European Union on a daily basis. That minimizes their risk in terms of shelf life. It minimizes their working capital. They're able to move the stock through quickly. And the capacity to do that basically means this system simply isn't fit for purpose. It will never serve that purpose. We'll come on to it later, but you know, this is not the same as receiving a container load of frozen lamb from New Zealand. We're trying to move goods quickly and efficiently, and basically the end-to-end delivery times have doubled since Brexit. Now, that's probably a lot less than some of the other those others of you here, but bear in mind we're talking about products which have a few days shelf life, and when you lose 24 hours, you're losing a good chunk of it. But what happens is those goods sit on a truck, on a loading bay somewhere, blocking it possibly, or just parked up somewhere waiting to go down to the port because of the pre-notification requirements and so on. So the delay at ports is a little difficult to define. Again, getting a little bit of feedback from one or two of our members, they're saying you know, that things have been slower outbound since GVMS, but they are getting through, and there are still circumstances where loads are sitting still for an hour or two, but it's not critical. But we haven't got, of course, to the full SPS situation at the moment. So I don't think there's any evidence of large build-ups. There was early on at ports, but certainly there is this issue of longer times taken to deliver goods.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'm delighted that we're now joined by Tim Reardon from Dover. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, and firstly, apologies for being a moment or two late. Tim Reardon, I'm Company Secretary and Head of EU Exit at Dover Harbour Board, and we are the owner and operator of the harbour in Dover. Brexit Central, as the press would have had us believe for the last 3 years, and certainly we've been very active in making our preparations, developing new processes to enable traffic to continue to get through the port once the UK left the European Union. And overall, I'm very pleased to say that traffic has continued to do just that. It certainly isn't seamless, it certainly isn't as easy as it was before, but with the exception of the last 2 weeks when other factors have intervened, the numbers of lorries passing through the port has now returned to the level of 2019, pre-pandemic, pre-Brexit. and that's a good measure of success in our view.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tim. Leslie, would you like to comment? I mean, we've heard that there are substantial extensions of time in the supply chain as a whole, but perhaps not at the port. Do you have a view to?
Yes, well, thank you. There are quite a few issues around all of this, but if I start off by talking about the easements that HMRC have allowed the importers in particular, this has been obviously something they had control over themselves. They can't control the paperwork and the flows exporting, as one of our speakers explained, we're just not exporting as much as we were. And that's actually in a strange way helping things, but not really for any good reasons, except that we're nodding things through rather than the rest of it. So the easements that HMRC have given us are great. The easement they gave us on the sanitary and phytosanitary products comes to an end in July, and we have to start doing it. We run training courses for the Food and Drink Federation, and we are finding that on SPS, and we're finding very few people actually bothering to learn, because a lot of people are expecting to hear the government's going to push that back again, which is an interesting thought. The whole issue around paperwork has been tremendous. There's the single document that you're talking about, the C88, that was formed, sort of came into being many years ago. I think it was 1992 came into play. We're now talking about a single window, which may help ease things as well. But these are all things that are going to happen in the future. We're not really sorting things out now, anything in particular. The Northern Irish problem is literally being swept under the carpet because people are just, within HMRC, just nodding cargoes through. They have a remit not to allow people to wait to get across to Northern Ireland in any shape or form. Something else that's being talked about is the trusted trader to try and help this, but I don't know whether we're going to cover that later. But most importantly, the Food and Drink Federation and I have been talking about creating, exactly as the gentleman's talking about from the cold storage, perhaps looking at export houses to try and start adding that extra tier to the export process to actually ensure that the paperwork can be done and the groupage isn't going to cause quite so much problem because it's just one consignor. That's what we're looking at the moment, and hopefully we might be able to give you a little bit more information on where we get to with that research. But yes, those are the main issues that we're seeing. People just aren't exporting. The imports are driving everyone crazy. The brokerage system that we've got in place, everyone was encouraged to become a customs broker, and the brokers don't want to touch food and drink. It takes too long, they can't make any money on it, and invariably there are issues that actually mean they spend a lot of time on those consignments instead of the probably 20 minutes they've got set aside.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Well, let's move to the second part of this, which is to talk about how the government perceives these issues and what they're trying to do to address them. Easements obviously being one aspect of that, and also to ask you to comment on the aspiration that the government has made clear, which is to have the best border, the most effective border in the world by 2025. To what extent do we think that's a reasonable aspiration, and what's actually happening to make it a reality? Tim, can I start with you?
Thank you. If we start with the furthest thing first, namely Borders 2025, at the moment that looks like a feeding fest for every IT consultancy and systems developer in the country who is seeing this as a great opportunity to promote new IT systems to support new government processes. We're engaged in several of those. I have to say the challenge that we are facing is that the work that's being done tends to start with the IT system rather than start with the objective that's trying to be achieved. Given also that the background of most of the systems developers we're working with in a ports and trade context is deep sea container depots and air cargo. We're looking at systems and processes which are fundamentally incompatible with road transport, which is how most food and drink passes between the UK and its continental neighbours, and indeed its Irish neighbours. And we're almost having to start again with the discussions that we had 3 years ago that resulted in the customs pre-lodgement model and other processes which have kept the borders flowing since the UK left the European Union. European processes came in at the start of last year, and UK processes came in at the start of this year. So that is not a promising story at the moment. We wait to see whether it turns into one. The bigger sort of strategic challenge that I see is that the border has almost become a political plaything for tinkering with and for forever trying to change processes and do things differently from how they're being done now. What that removes is firstly stability. It makes it very difficult to plan, and it creates a real point of stress around supply chains because the businesses and the merchants at either end of those supply chains are almost in the dark about, beyond the immediate term, what it is they'll be complying with. Personally, I would take a proper step back and have a more open-minded conversation and thinking piece about what the purpose of the UK's border with its neighbouring countries actually is. Are we trying to keep out Danish bacon because we suddenly think it's become dodgy? Or are we trying to keep supermarket shelves filled in the UK and enable UK businesses to sell stuff overseas? Let's not start from where we are, and let's absolutely not start with the capabilities of IT systems and existing control processes. Let's look at what ultimately we're trying to do. And I'll give you an example of that. When we were looking to, Brexit brought an end to the ability to go to France and buy unlimited quantities of wine and bring it back in your car. For the majority of visitors to France, buying wine was an integral part of the trip because it's one of the things you went to France for, and if you went to France for something else, it's one of the things you did while you were there. The Brexit rulebook, the borders rulebook, would have imposed on top of that established practice a duty-free allowance of 1 bottle of spirits, and I think it was 5 1/4 bottles of wine. Question to government: do you want to criminalise normal, regular activity by normal people, which they've been doing for years? Answer no. Do you want Border Force to be tasked with trying to find the person who's got a 6th full bottle of wine in the car boot, rather than looking for smuggling of things that cause harm to the UK? Answer no. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to construct a regime which intercepts things of genuine harm, but lets normal activity continue undisturbed. What was the answer to that? Let's set a duty-free allowance, which is different from the one that we've had previously, but which accommodates what is in effect a boot full of wine for a couple driving to France, so that they can continue to go do what they're doing now, come back, breaking no laws because the law now accommodates what they're doing, and without requiring a limited government border force resource to be devoted to tracking down things that that cause no harm to anybody. So we stepped back, thought again, what we're trying to achieve, we got a sensible outcome, and it was different from where we were. And I would like to see us take the same approach to the broader generality of UK border controls on goods, be they customs controls or be they animal and plant health controls. Animal and plant health controls, is there a risk? What risk are we trying to deal with? And if we accept that there is one, then what is the best way to deal with it? Is the best way to stop stuff at the frontier, and stop everything else in the lorries behind the one you have stopped? Or is it actually better done, built into the overall buying and selling process? And if you want to look at stuff, look at it when it's at point of delivery, where it's in a facility where it can be accessed in safety, in appropriate hygienic conditions, and those sorts of things. Similarly, what's the purpose of a customs control in a context where you've got no customs duty? Is it purely a statistical reporting exercise? And if it is, then is that fundamentally a frontier process at all? Or would it be better done through periodic accounts in the same way as you account for your VAT? Let's step back and have a think about what we're trying to achieve, rather than rush in and be led by processes that were developed in other contexts for other purposes.
Thank you, Tim. I think that's a very thought-provoking piece of evidence. Thank you. Peter, would you like to comment on our aspirations for the border?
Well, as I'm heavily involved in the SPS side of things, as Tim will know, we've crossed paths on numerous occasions. I probably have a slightly different perspective, because as we all know, this isn't just about the European Union. This is about the UK's SPS controls on goods coming from all over the world. And if you're going to apply that sort of, and I think it's eminently sensible to apply some sort of risk-based approach to these things, you need to square this off with our obligations at WTO and so on. It's not straightforward, and it needs a degree of reciprocity. So I guess my aspirations are probably the same as Tim's, but I think the route I would take to get to them is to move back to looking genuinely at some form of regulatory alignment, because I think otherwise we're going to have an issue in the other direction, because as things stand at the moment, the EU show no signs whatsoever taking a similar approach reciprocally. So I think there's an opportunity there. Obviously, we would like to see seamless borders, and I do share the view that the place to do these things isn't necessarily at the border, but perhaps in a warehouse or at the point of delivery. I have no view on the IT side of it, other than to say that, as things stand at the moment, the bit of the process that slows us up is the plant and animal health bit. And whether technology can overcome that or not is questionable in my view. And it's something, which needs a different approach, which is to look at the fundamental point that Tim raised, and that is, why are we doing this, and is there a better way to start with? Because we might be inventing something we don't really need.
May I make a quick point here?
You may, Leslie. I've got to watch the time.
Tim, so I really agree with what you're saying about taking a step back, but I also think it's really important for us to understand what we can change and what we have to work with. Because the biggest issue that keeps coming up with the government's new ideas all the time is that they think they can change everything. And actually, there's a certain parameter, as Peter's just saying, that we have to work within, which is WTO and the WCO as well. So I just wanted to make that one point, because I think we keep tripping up on this.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I'm now going to hand over to Hilary Benn. Hilary, would you like to please ask your questions?
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Look, we've seen reported this week that full checks on goods coming in from the EU, which were due to be applied in July, might well be delayed yet again. And the question I want to ask all of you is, what is the government worried about? And do you think that delaying the introduction of those full checks would be a good idea or not? Could I start with you, Shane?
Trying to work out what the government's worried about from one day to the next is one of our biggest challenges. But I guess I'd see it in two ways. And one of them is probably Tim's best place to talk about, which is exactly how prepared are they to manage the actual process of getting, basically, we've got to work out how we're going to get particularly lorries rolling off the Port of Dover through to the border control posts, and make sure that happens in a controlled way and they've got the systems in place to do that. There are still things like how much are we going to charge for those services, who's going to control them, how is that all going to work, that still aren't particularly well communicated to the industry, even at this stage. So there are some considerations in that regard, and they tend to win out the day with government. You know, their immediate concerns over the bits they control are not looking like they get it wrong. That often seems to be the main driver of pushback. But I guess I said publicly and I've said privately to ministers that I think they should push back the 1st of July deadline for SPS controls, because, and I think for two reasons. One is because this is the wrong year to do this. You know, we're facing rampant cost inflation on our food supplies. We've got huge supply chain stress. There's a huge amount of sort of pressures underway. This is an unnecessary thing to put onto the top of everything else right now. And if we can push it back, that in my set is a persuasive enough argument for me in the short term to do that. However, I am very aware of the fact that we're 18 months. By July, we'll be 18 months past when we're supposed to be implementing these rules. And there is a question of how long do you keep pushing these things back for? And I guess my point would be push it back, but don't just push it back for 6 months for an operational reason. Push it back properly for a fundamental step back and think about the issues and look at it from first principles. And I agree with Tim's point from earlier that it's an IT showcase at the moment of let's take the current rules and work out an IT fix that will hide this all away somewhere in a computer, which I don't think is genuinely a realistic ambition. And I basically align with what Peter said, which is actually we are set back to say, right, well, how do we come up with a new way of legislating, a new legislative framework, particularly for food controls, in order to do this smarter.
Okay. And would the potential consequence be, one, increasing prices to consumers if it came in, and two, delays in getting products onto shelves, just practically? Is that what people are worried about?
Those two things, and things that won't come.
And things that just won't be available anymore.
Yeah, they won't be available, at least at first. There'll be a big interruption. You know, if you look at the export patterns on the 1st of January 2021, there was a period of time for a good 2 or 8 weeks, 12 weeks, where their goods just didn't move. Fish industry, certain types of other exports, and then we've seen a new pattern, a new normal emerge. That will play out from the 1st of July, because we have absolutely zero visibility of how prepared EU exporters are to start doing the things after the 1st of July. And that is something that the government, for all of their efforts to communicate, haven't really. We have no control over what preparations there are across 28 member states and every hundreds of thousands of businesses across the EU.
Okay, that is really helpful. Peter.
The other reasons is they're simply not ready. We are still waiting for all of the BCPs to designate whether they can handle SPS or not. We know that the projects in Wales are significantly delayed at the moment, just past the planning stage, if that. In one case, they've decided not to go ahead the planning process because they found a large number of bats on the location. We have been told by government that they can't necessarily firm up on some of these BCPs until June at the earliest. So we're looking at bashing up against the 1st of July date, even under the best circumstances. So on top of all the things that Shane's quite rightly pointed out, and I'm not speaking for Dover, Tim, I'm sure you are well set up, but many are not, and it is very difficult, therefore, to plan your logistics and so on. So I think as well as the issues around cost, and they would be significant, and certainly have inflationary pressure, as well as making some businesses simply decide not to supply. You've got this issue of preparedness, which I think, on top of the lack of vets, by the way, which is also important, is also a factor in their thinking, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, Tim.
Thank you. I would very much echo the points that have been made already.
Okay.
The fundamental ones: will the supply chain bear the cost at all of the additional stuff that's being put upon it? And will the new processes dislocate the supply chain so that it stops working for certain perishable, very time-sensitive product? Answer to both of those questions, I don't know. The way the import process has been designed, the lorries will flow through our port with no issues at all. The issues are all inland at what happens when they get to the Crown sites where they will be examined, and how will the IT systems and documentary checks which run through those IT systems function. We have no visibility of that yet. We keep asking for it. And there are additional complications in Kent, where government has created 2 Crown sites about whether it will require lorries to attend one or other site, depending on what's in the lorry. And all of that has potential implications for the functioning of the supply chain. What we would like government to do, where it has 2 sites, one on each road that leaves Dover and takes lorries inland to points of destination, is to enable or to permit the lorry, where it's selected for an examination, to attend whichever of the 2 sites happens to be on its route to its delivery point, rather than instructing a lorry to go to a particular site when that site may involve a significant diversion from the route that it was already taking. And where it's a smaller site on the smaller road, the A2, which is not reliably always open, we clearly can't have a circumstance where a lorry is told to use a road that is shut. We need flexibility within the array of inland BCPs to reflect the flexibility of routing, dynamic routing, which is at the heart of the efficient functioning of the road transport network in the UK. The Crown facilities need to be capable of reflecting the real world of how lorries move around the UK, rather than trying to tell them where they should go and act as though they were a small boy with a train set who was trying to tell traffic where he wanted it to go.
Okay. Can I just, going back to your initial, I think it was your second answer to Peter about what do we want from our border in future? Can I take the example of oranges? Because it came up when we were in Belfast. Now, we don't have a domestic orange growing industry. So the argument could go, we don't really need to check oranges for pests and diseases, black spot in particular, when oranges arrive across the short straits into Dover. But it becomes an issue when supermarkets that bought those oranges then want to send them across the Irish Sea to supermarkets in Northern Ireland, because the EU says, well, they might have black spot. If you haven't checked them for black spot, then that could potentially be a problem if the orange makes its way into the EU and an orange grove and affects the plants. That's maybe a bit of a tortuous scenario, but I suppose it could conceivably happen. In those circumstances, so I'm asking about the interrelationship between what happens across the short straits and what happens across the Irish Sea under the protocol. Where would be the sensible place to do a check on a particular product where the EU was arguing in the discussions about the implementation of the protocol that they needed to be confident that it met their standards before it appeared in Northern Ireland? Should it be in Dover or the associated sites you're just talking about, or should it be in Larne or Belfast?
I think I'd take the view that if a piece of product has come from the EU, they oughtn't to refuse it when it returns.
I'm talking about oranges coming from Morocco, say.
If it reaches us, then it will have driven through the European Union to get to us.
Right, but if it's come directly to Dover or, I don't know, Felixstowe, wherever, I mean, it's a very practical question about where the check, if there needs to be one, would most sensibly be done.
It seems to, firstly, that there are a number of different products where exactly the same scenario arises. And I would put the question back to the Europeans or whoever's creating the problem, and invite them to point to the real life circumstance where it does actually arise, rather than as a concept, because I don't think it does for real. We're not going to be importing olives into the UK and then sending them off to Ireland, where they might cause problems in Irish olive groves because there aren't any.
That's a very fair point. No, that is extremely helpful answer. Leslie.
Yes.
So on this question of the delay, what the government's worried about, and if the government continues to be worried about this, what does this mean for the likelihood of full SPS checks ever being applied? And it goes back to the point that you made about people say, well, they've delayed it 3 times. It looks like they might delay it again. It's not really worth my while doing the training.
Yeah, yes, and preparing for it, exactly. And the biggest issue that the smaller exporters have in particular is that they're, well, importers as well, is the planning and timing of all of these things and how they can get, how they can get on top of it. I think the non-preparedness of the HMRC, the borders, does worry people. I wonder whether they've got enough staff to really manage this. And as everybody agrees, they don't want to stop importing things. And the more they stop importing, the more empty shelves we have. And it becomes a never-ending cycle. I think it goes back to the fact that we've politicized trade to such an extent now that we really need to move ourselves away from that and keep going back to the practical sides of things, exactly as you were saying. We've got to talk about the Northern Irish, which actually isn't causing huge problems at the moment, only because nobody's really acknowledging what's going on, and I think it's still there. It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? The free trade agreements that we've signed, I think, they feel like a misnomer in some ways because, although it says free trade, it's only free trade for goods that are actually originating in this country or the country which we've got the free trade agreement with, and that's causing a lot of issues around rules of origin and how we actually declare these things. So again, it would be quite a relief to a lot of businesses if well, I know that that's not being rigorously adhered to at the moment as far as declarations are concerned.
Right. Okay. Thank you. An SPS agreement with the EU, which has been touched on the evidence this morning. Do I take it from all of our 4 witnesses that you think it would be a jolly good idea if we could reach such an agreement with them?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's the thing that we're not allowed to talk about with government because it's against the kind of, if there is a strategic position, it is that we will not formally align with the EU over SPS controls, and that plays into their conversations about global trading positions. I think you would know better than most, Henry. But the point is that obviously there's a difference between the equivalence idea on the UK side and the alignment view on the EU side, and that just basically hit a stalemate. But in reality, at some point over the next 10 years, whatever, that is where we're going to have to end up if we're going to have a mature approach to how we feed ourselves in terms of how neighbours collaborate over food. And that's what's going to be required. It's probably about how you get there in a politically sound way that doesn't just inflame the usual frustrating conversations and frictions between Remainers and Brexiteer ideology.
Yeah. Anyone else want to I take it you all think an SPS agreement would be a good thing?
It would, but my experience of them is, first of all, free trade agreements per se don't help. I mean, the TCA is probably the #1 free trade agreement, and we've got all these problems. So the FTA per se does nothing to resolve these issues. And sadly, there wasn't a comprehensive SPS chapter, which means that even that wasn't addressed. The difficulty with veterinary agreements, equivalence agreements, is that they do not get rid of certification requirements as such. They can do, I suppose, but I've yet to find one that does. The one that's always quoted is the New Zealand agreement, which is certainly helpful, but it does not eliminate the requirement for an export health certificate, nor does it eliminate the requirement for physical checks on consignments arriving in the UK. So they are subjected to a low level of checks, and they have a simplified export health certificate, but they still need to provide one. And more importantly, because their goods are coming from 6 weeks shipping away, some of the time critical issues that we face, they don't face. So it's I caution against anyone drawing an analogy there and saying, oh, one is the same as the other, because they're not. My own view is that alignment is the way forward. I completely share Shane's reservations about that from a political point of view, but there are examples out there, like the arrangement between the European Union and Switzerland, which the Swiss called autonome Nachvollzug, which means autonomous adaptation, which effectively is effectively saying we're aligned, but we make the decision to be aligned, and that's how it's structured legally. So it is alignment, but it's dynamic alignment. What's more, but it allows them to trade freely with the EU. Actually, it's not particularly liked by the European Commission, as everybody will probably know. But perhaps that's a good thing, because if you're trying to sell it to people who are a little bit anti it, you can say, well, it's something that's not entirely popular. But I think it's something the EU would go for. Without that, we're not going to completely get rid of requirements. So equivalence is one thing, but what do you do when you start changing things? And I still have anyone to say to me how we are disadvantaged in our trade agreements with other third countries by remaining aligned, because that, as I see it, things like hormone treated beef, well, we've made a decision we're not going to allow it. So what are we going to vary? That's the question.
All right, well, yeah, on that last point, wait and see. But anyway, I'm running out of time, I think. But
yes,
Tim,
I think we are, Hilary. Yeah,
we are. Just Tim, very quickly.
Thank you. On the question of SPS equivalence agreements and indeed an FTA, the key thing is what those agreements actually say. Because it's all very well having equivalent standards on both sides of the channel, but if you've still got border controls on things crossing the channel, then almost the value of those equivalent standards is lost. Because what causes an obstruction to the supply chain is having to produce the documents, the liability for examination, and the inability to respond in a dynamic and fast way to orders that require to be fulfilled tomorrow, because the border crossing regime on top of the equivalence agreement gets in the way. In the same way that the FTA agreement, which gets rid of customs tariffs, doesn't help anybody, because you've still got customs processes to pay no tariff in order to bring the stuff across the border.
Yeah, as we have heard in really quite sobering evidence this morning. I'm so grateful to all of you. Peter, back to you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Alan.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you to the panel. We've been talking about the increased difficulty of actually conducting trade with the European Union. At the same time, imports from the rest of the world have continued to grow over 2021. I wonder if any of you can sort of cast any light on the sort of thing that interests me as an economist. Are the new regulations on Europe actually creating new incentives to import from the rest of the world? Are they encouraging imports from the rest of the world? And are businesses starting to think, well, actually, we might as well go outside Europe because it's now equally difficult? I understand there's some, it's different with very fresh shipments, but the stuff that is not so desperately time sensitive, to what extent are the new regulations encouraging imports from the rest of the world? Perhaps I can start with Leslie.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We're not quite sure whether it really is encouraging at the moment. I think the difference is very much that businesses who were already trading outside of Europe are actually engaging with that great deal. The people that are of the most concern are the 135,000 businesses that only traded with the EU, and whether they are actually turning their businesses into more international. It's very difficult. So we're facing a lot of information coming through from the government where they're saying just do it and exporting's easy, etc. And I have to say that it's something that I've railed against for a great number of years. Exporting isn't easy. It's easy when you know how, and it's easy when you understand the processes. But you still have to go through the processes. You can't get away from that. And I'm not really quite sure exactly where any growth is coming from, because of course now we've merged the three different organizations that provide statistics on trade. It means that we're doing a pick and mix as far as the stats that are are being given to us. So I'm afraid I'm reading very carefully and taking a very large pinch of salt with some of these. I know the New Zealand trade deal was going, we have 5,900 people that trade with New Zealand, which means that, you know, of the 5 million people out there, there's quite a lot of them buying UK goods, which I'm finding quite difficult to understand how that demand is you know, going to support us all. But the basic thing that I find is that businesses are not exporting as much as they should, and they're not treating it as a project as you would if you were doing something with your accounts. You would go to an accountant and you'd be working with them. A lot of people are now trying to do it all themselves and feel they have to do it themselves. They're not researching things properly. They're making mistakes, and it's putting them off doing any more. And it's a problem. It's a real problem out there.
Thank you. Shane, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, the answer is we don't know for sure. I mean, one of the things about the last 2 years is we've had an unprecedented economic situation for food supplies, or just supplies generally, because of the pandemic. But my theory is that the coming out of dealing with the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, has overlaid with the new complications of Brexit, and therefore it's harder to get product from the EU for people that are used to trading a certain way, i.e. not trading, not importing, are having to import now, certainly on the customs side. Since the overlaid with the pandemic, and that there's been an opportunity there for people that are used to bringing product in from other places, who are more used to the systems, to actually make up the shortfall. But that is more theory than I can prove with substantive evidence. But I think that we have to obviously, you know, in a way, for those that want to sort of tell the economic story of Brexit, the pandemic is the big complicating factor.
Yes, indeed. Great misfortune for us economists to have confounded this experiment. Peter.
Yes, I, as far as imports are concerned, certainly in our sector, there's not overwhelming evidence of that happening. I suspect in time, in the full course of time, the free trade agreements we've reached with Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere will see increased imports of red meat from those countries, something which I've expressed concern about, because I think that the deals have been badly structured. But I think there is an irony here, and that is that it's taken the additional complication of importing from the EU to realize it's now just as difficult to import it from the EU as it is from elsewhere, so you might as well look elsewhere as well. So I suspect your observation isn't wrong. I think that there probably has been more widely a view taken, well, if we've got to jump through all these hoops, we might as well jump through them and import it from somewhere else. It's not strongly the case in our sector, that's all I would say.
Thanks. Tim, I don't know if you have any observations from Dover. I understand you have a geographical limitation.
My sole observation would be that we haven't seen a material reduction in the number of laden lorries coming into Dover from the continent. So if there is a reduction in importing from the EU, it's happening somewhere else.
Or the lorries are carrying less stuff.
There's no indication of that.
Is that right? Okay. Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting aside.
If I may, I just don't think it's about importing. I think it's about exporting that the government are trying to drive it. You know, they're trying to suggest that, and they reckon that the figures, the Guardian produced figures saying they were 14% down on exports. And I think that's the key area there. Sorry.
Yes, but the import data, accepting all the reservations you expressed, Leslie, the import data seem to suggest a much bigger fall in imports relative to 2-3 years ago. But I mean, I'm asking the question because I'm So let me pass back to Peter, otherwise we carry on the morning. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much, Alan. Tamara, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Chair. So my question is, do we have evidence of rising costs for deliveries to or from the UK? I'd like to start with Tim, please.
The short answer is we don't. The costs of the fixed costs of using the port of Dover have been apportioned differently over the course of the last 3 years, because essentially the element that would previously have been borne by tourist ferry traffic has instead had to be borne by lorries because there has been no tourist ferry traffic. But that's not a function of Brexit. With apologies, it doesn't really answer your question.
So it's hard to extrapolate. It makes a case of COVID impacts rather than Brexit impacts.
In respect of port costs, for sure, but they are a small element of the overall supply chain cost.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Yes, we have very compelling evidence of the increase in export costs, and they have largely doubled end to end. If you start with export health certification, we've moved from producing around 3,000 export health certificates a year to 3,000 to 300,000. So a multiple increase in the number of EHCs. That's costing around £60 million to the food and drink industry to start with. And then you've got the costs of export agents charging anything between £50 and £100, import agents anything between £300 and £500, and that is provided the consignment doesn't suffer a delay in Dover. If they get in Calais, if they go through quickly, then that's fine, but they can be held sometimes overnight. So all in all, and again, I surveyed the members before this meeting just to get some sense of this. The cost of delivering goods to the EU has doubled, and I would expect that to be reflected on imports as well. Now that has to that in figures, that's around an additional £1,000 to £1,200 per truckload. Now, for a full truckload of meat, you might say, well, that's not a lot, but we're talking about an industry which works on 2% margins here. So those sorts of costs have a significant impact on competitiveness in our industry. And of course, they will add to the costs on imports as well. One of the big challenges we've had, and indeed importers will have, is historically, we've always delivered on a DDP basis. Now, when you don't have a border, it's not a DDP basis, it's delivered. But once you have a border, it's a DDP basis. And most of our European customers expect us to continue to supply on that basis. So all of the costs end to end are shouldered by the exporter. And that has had a significant effect.
That was what I wanted to ask, who was taking the brunt of the impact of the cost. So it's really on, and you're working within a 2% margin. So how much do you think it's to decrease that margin?
Well, it's probably it's difficult to say, but it's probably a fraction of a percentage, a 0.25% or something. But if you take that over the total margin, that's a significant cut, and it's not sustainable. And the real problem is the system is not designed to cover this type of fast-moving trade. And we've talked about it already, but we need to review that because the costs are mounting, and of course they're very discouraging. We talked about groupage earlier. For groupage, it's even more complicated. Leslie did talk indeed about a consolidation model, but it's difficult where there's SPS involved, because you may need multiple export health certificates anyway, and the consignment stands or falls on the weakest part of it. So if one bit of the consignment has a problem, the whole consignment gets held up, and effectively groupage is stopped because of that.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Could I go to Leslie, please?
Yeah, because we seem to be focusing very much on road transport and everything to do with, exports and imports from that. But if we also take it a little bit broader and we look at the problems people have had on freight, containers have gone up from £2,500 per container to 15, sometimes 20,000. We've got a whole backlog of containers in Felixstowe. It's backing up all over the world. This is causing problems when people want to try and export in particular, but also for people trying to bring goods into the country. So I know one very large manufacturer who's actually having to go into Holland to get some goods broken up, because they would normally take them into Felixstowe, and they're now breaking them into smaller packages and taking them down to DP ports, because it's getting to be messy. And then they have more road haulage problems when they get back into the UK again. So the costs are phenomenal as far as freight's concerned, and it's becoming more of an issue. The other thing, picking up on the point about DDP, which is the Incoterm that covers this, so it's delivered duty paid, That's the duty on the goods, but also the VAT on the goods. And this has caused a huge problem because we now realise we have to pay the VAT in the European Union. And that's really made a phenomenal difference to businesses who didn't realise. A lot of businesses were bringing in goods from China, from India, and they were bringing them in, paying duty once on them, paying VAT once on them, and then free circulation across into the EU. They're now having to pay more duty and actually trying to account for VAT into that European country now as well. So it's stopping a lot of that movement and it's confused people. So in actual fact, you know, the TCA, the freight costs, the energy costs, the health certificates, the VAT, you know, you name it. And this is all, if you're piling this all onto a small business, that's an awful lot of regulatory they've got. And now we're finding that people are trying to talk to them about the new packaging, the new instead of the CE marking, we're going to have the UK CA marking, trying to talk to people over in China and India about doing this, and they're being told that their country is too small for actually to be able to warrant actually having a specific packaging for it. So, you know, these are all causing a lot of problems for businesses. And, you know, I hear people with all sorts of issues and they're shocked that they didn't realise that the trade and cooperation wasn't going to cover goods that came in from China and India.
Yeah, I think that's been a shock to a lot of the businesses I've spoken to in the fashion industry.
Yeah,
I mean, I've noted that some people who have used the container issue to say that this is a global issue. It's got nothing to do with the UK leaving the EU. Is it hard for us to extrapolate that from that argument, do you think?
Yes, it is. In this one case, I would tend to say, yeah, this is a huge problem, but it's a huge problem because there are issues over in Los Angeles and Long Island. We've got problems. China's got problems. We all got muddled. You know, when the train timetables and you end up with the trains all in different places, and we need to get them back to the beginning. We need a global agreement to how we are going to do this and how we're going to get on top of it. Because at the moment, people are just basically, you know, making a lot of money out of something that's other people's pain, really, and impacting on all of our cost of living.
Thank you very much. Shane, if I could ask the same question to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. The cost inflation is everywhere for a supply chain operation. You know, fuel costs, labor costs, electricity costs for the warehousing, for refrigerated warehousing, certification, but also competition as well. And one of the questions there is the number of choices that are available to do the haulage for you is in decline, because there are lots of businesses that have decided, because of the pandemic as much as Brexit, but effectively that they've decided not to service the UK, and therefore the choice in the of a haulier is declined, and therefore that creates an inflationary pressure on the cost as well. And I think the key point here about this, and one of the reasons about the 1st July and potentially taking the pressure off ourselves for a little bit longer, is this human factor around what do you do in the face of the significant pressure. You make decisions about how to simplify your business. And for EU-based exporters who produce maybe 5-10% of what they produce to service the UK, why, if they're facing all these pressures and all these issues, I mean, why not simplify? And if it's particularly complicated to service the UK, then you cut that out of the operation in order to sort of go in maintenance mode to get through this economic situation with all these inflationary pressures. And that, I think, is probably the consideration. It's not about singling out Brexit as the cause of inflationary cost, but saying that it is a fundamentally complicating factor at a time when businesses are under significant stress. And that's where I think the cost situation comes to play, rather than sort of trying to single it out as the cause.
But do you, I mean, I wasn't here for the first part, so excuse me if this was part of it. I spoke to people in the food industry, in the health food industry, because I've got a personal interest in that. And a lot of the food was going through Rotterdam. Do you think that this is going to increase Rotterdam's opportunity at UK or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I think we must be brief here because we're running out of time.
I know. Sorry, I just wanted to know about that. Sorry.
I think obviously the issue of how you enter the EU single market and whether you therefore continue to service the UK from your entry point in the EU single market is a sort of fundamental readjustment point that will play out over the coming years. I don't think it's specifically a consideration in terms of costs, but but to be clear, there are significant Brexit costs around certification. We're talking about £400-ish more per load to just for the certification and dealing with that element, and Peter said it already. But for groupage, if you're sending one pallet and it's £400, then that is basically kills that trade as a not viable thing. If it's a lorry load, then okay, you can potentially lose the £400 as an overall value of the good.
Yeah. Sorry, Chair, for running slightly over.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of the session, and what I'd like to do is to ask each of our witnesses briefly to give us their top recommendation for government as they consider how to improve our border situation. Peter, can I start with you?
Well, apart from perhaps suggesting that we re-enter the single market, which I don't think is going to run, but seriously is the best solution of all. I think that the key thing for us is to focus, as Tim said, on completely rethinking why we're doing what we're doing. I'm not a customs expert, but certainly on the SPS side, we need to go back to the fundamentals of looking at, taking a risk-based approach, particularly in our trade with the European Union, and ideally structuring that around some sort of veterinary agreement, which for political reasons I won't call alignment, but which I think needs to look like alignment.
Thank you, Peter. Leslie, you next.
Well, I've got a very short list, really. It's I think we should be working in conjunction with other borders. If we're going to be good, we've got to actually make sure it works in unison with other border controls that are going on out there. I think we need to spend longer on the trade agreements and include more about it, so that when we're setting up this single window, which is the new thing that's coming through, that's going to make a huge difference. And the veterinary equivalence is an absolute no-brainer, as they say. We've got to get that sorted out soon.
Thank you. Tim?
As a first step, very short-term, very immediate step, government should ditch the plan that it's pursued completely doggedly to impose customs safety and security declarations from the middle of this year. These add no value. They originated in an environment where customs declarations arrived after the goods, and the idea was to have customs information before the goods, so you could identify things you might want to look at before they turned up. In the new post-Brexit world that we've got, all those customs declarations come before the goods anyway, so what's the purpose of asking for this extra one, particularly when it's awkward to do and risks obstructing the flow of the supply chain. More generally, let's have that root and branch first principles look at what we're trying to achieve with a border control, rather than proceeding on the basis that we want a border because it's a nice political totem. Let's try and work out what we're trying to do. And once we've sussed that out, let's find a sensible way of doing it. Ultimately, this is about regulating standards within supply chains. So let's work around the supply chain as a whole, rather than trying to interrupt the flow of goods at the most difficult, most inconvenient point, namely at the frontier. And let's also be mature and sensible about the use of border controls, and particularly declarations to identify stuff that's dodgy. Smugglers won't declare their contraband. That's not what they do. There's no point in imposing declaration requirements to catch stuff that is illegal. Doesn't work. This is about regulating functioning professional supply chains. Let's treat them with respect. Let's build around the supply chain rather than interrupt it in the middle.
Thank you very much, Tim. And finally, Shane, to you.
Thank you. I agree with everything that everyone's saying in closing statements. I think unfortunately, I regret to say this, because it is 18 months since these rules should be imposed. We should hit the pause button on the SPS controls for this year, but use that time to rethink first principles, what we want to achieve, to echo Tim's point, and look at it from the point of view of the legislation requirement, and look at the issues around alignment and equivalence again, in order to come up with an IT solution that is trying to achieve a specific goal around reducing friction at the border for our goods inbound from the single market into the UK.
Thank you very much. And so we must now draw to a close. I want to thank all of our witnesses from the first session and from this session very, very much indeed. We've heard some very, very interesting, indeed compelling evidence about our current situation and some great recommendations for us to ponder on and to work out how to make the best of them. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.